Hello and welcome to another Unreal Masterclass tutorial video. In this video we'll be looking at creating landscapes using materials and the landscaping tools within the Unreal Engine itself. I have just started a new level within our template, and the first thing I'm going to want to do is select my floor, and I'm going to hit delete because I will not be using that for this scene. Over here we have our mode select button, and I'm going to change this to the landscape tool, or shift 2. This will bring up our landscape tools on this side here, where we have the options to create a new landscape. We can also sculpt and paint, and also if we have any materials pre-created, we can add them in this point here. I'm not going to worry about that yet. I'm going to work through this in a step-by-step manner. So the first thing I want to do is under Manage and New, I'm going to change my section size to be 15 by 15 quads, because I don't need a huge landscape for the purpose of this tutorial. I'm going to keep it a 1 by 1 section, which is the size of these squares here. And I'm going to keep the resolution as default. Again, we could adjust these if we wanted to. I'm just going to keep everything default for the purposes of this video to make life easier. And then I'm going to press Create. And this will create us this UV mapped surface here. If I was to look underneath it, you can see it's transparent. So this is essentially a plane. But once I have created our landscape, we'll notice it automatically goes to the sculpt mode. So our sculpt tool is, try to think of this like we're working with clay. We can sculpt by adding, or we can sculpt by taking away. If you want to take away, we'd hold shift and click, and that would carve into our landscape. And if I was to just left mouse click and drag, that would add to our landscape. I can adjust the type of brush I'm using, the amount of fall off there is, the strength of the brush, by just dialing in these settings here, not too much unlike Photoshop, for example. I can adjust my brush size if I want to be more finesse, and the fall off of how much it will sort of gradually shift between the selection and the area next to it. So I'm just going to start sculpting my land. I'm not really going in with any real intention of a plan in mind. If I was to want to bring in a custom landscape, I could do. So to do that, I would create a height map in something like Photoshop or Blender. Again, different tools out there. There's plenty of tutorials online if you want to look at how to do that yourself. I'm literally trying to stick within the engine itself, such as adjust its tool strength and make it a bit bigger just to make this a bit quicker, because I'm not really aiming to make anything super amazing for the purposes of this video. So that's a bit too high there. So let's just start adding a bit of motion. Now, what you'd want to realistically do is think about what this kind of land would represent. How flat would you want it to be? Would you want any kind of like paths or lakes in the way? So I'm going to just carve in to our land a little bit by holding Shift and left mouse button, and just bring my brush size down a bit so I can start sculpting out this kind of like ditch through my landscape. And again, the longer I hold my brush over the area, the more it'll just keep carving in or adding to my selection. And that will do for now. I'm not too worried about what this looks like. I can also use things like the smooth brush to smooth out the edges if I've got a sharp edge somewhere I'm not quite happy with. Like, for example, my geometry is looking a bit too sharp over there, so I'm just going to smooth it out a bit. Flatten would flatten everything to the middle of the selection onwards. So if I was to drag this, it would flatten everything from that point as I'll hold my left mouse button and drag. Ramp is more if we want to sort of add a kind of ramp like that. So I can drag between 2 points and create ramps. I'm not going to be doing that in this scene, but it is an option. Erosion. So this tries to simulate natural erosion on our landscape. So adds a bit of noise, a bit of unevenness to things. Likewise, Hydro tries to do a similar thing to simulate rainfall or corrosion of rain over an area over a period of time, especially good if you're using like rocks, etc. And then you have noise, which is even more uneven than erosion, for example. The other tools I'm not going to worry about, but we have things like visibility, whether we want something to be visible or not, blueprints, where we could add in a blueprint brush if we've got a custom one made, and our mirror tools for if we want to mirror paint an area. Again, not going to worry about those. So everything we're making is on this layer here. So we've got, by default, it creates us this one single layer. And we'll be talking about why layers are more important as we go further into this world building exercise. But for now, we need to now start thinking about how we're going to start painting our landscape, adding textures, adding materials to this. Well, the easiest way to do that, it would be to use our paint tool. But we can't just select a material and drag it on. Well, we could, but if we want to have a bit more nuance in there and have a kind of earth, rock, grass, and be able to blend them together more seamlessly and have a bit more control of our textures and our landscape, we'll need to create a custom material. So I'm going to go into my materials folder here. I'm going to right click and select material. I'm going to call this landscape matte. And then I'm going to double click it to open it. I'm going to leave our settings here by default. And what you'll find is, I've already kind of done this to make it a bit easier, but I have already added in some materials from Fab. So if you do not have any textures already, you'll need to source these online. Ideally, you want textures that can be tileable. So I have these three textures here, one being a forest floor, another one being a kind of rocky surface, and then our third one being some uncut grass. And I'm just going to drag the texture, so the base texture here, not the normal or the specular AO one. And I'm going to do that for each of my three textures. So my rock, my grass, and my forest floors, or dirt in this case. And I want to have these three textures here contextually applied to the same material, but allow me to be able to select those layers individually. So the way to do that is I right click and I type in landscape. And I want to look for this one here that's called landscape layer blend. I'm just going to hook this up to our base color. Now, we look at this and it doesn't look like it's doing anything. That's because it actually isn't yet. We need to be able to tell it that each of these three textures here are going to be a separate layer that we can select between and paint individually, but the more to still apply to this one overall material that would be on our landscape. So with our landscape layer blend selected, over here where it says material expression landscape layer blend, and there's layers, I'm going to click the plus button. I'm going to drop down this index that's been created and call our first one grass. I'm not going to change anything else quite yet, but I could change things like the density or the quality of that texture. Next layer, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to add plus and add one more index. So this will be index 1. And I'm going to call this one rock. Bear in mind, the names I give these will be important, so please try and follow along with the name conventions I'm using. Main reason we're calling these things is so when we want to look at our foliage tool, we'll actually be able to have foliage dynamically added to our map based on the layer name that is chosen. And then my final one, I'm just going to call dirt, just for the sake of making life a bit easier. And then I'm going to plug my grass into my grass, rock into my rock, and my dirt into my dirt. Now nothing here will change, so when I press apply we shouldn't see any real changes here. It'll just look like a big black non-texture. Don't worry, that is normal. I'm just going to press save and minimize this. I'm going to go back to my materials folder, And over here where we have our texture, actually I'm going to go back to selection, sorry, quickly. I'm going to select my landscape. Okay, go over to where it says landscape material over in our details panel, and I'm going to drag my landscape matte onto that landscape material. Now everything will just go black like this. Again, don't worry, this is because we've not yet finished the process. So with that done, I can go back to my landscape tool. And we now need to apply the layers in here. So we need to use the same name conventions when we're creating the layers on the target layers option within the paint panel on landscape mode, as we've used for as the layer names within this material here. So I'm going to click plus to create a layer. And you'll notice it's already by default chosen our landscape material. Under the layer name, I'm going to change this to grass and hit enter. And you'll now notice it picks up the grass layer from within that material. We're not done yet. We need to go over to this little plus on that grass to create layer info. And we're choosing the weight blended layer normal. We navigate to our materials folder and we need to save this grass layer info. So just save it into our materials folder. And now you'll see that the grass is applied to our landscape. We're not going to worry about the quality of it quite yet because we're not finished with this process. So back with the layers tab, I'm going to click plus once more. Call this, double click on that layer, and we're going to rename this layer to rock. And if this works, it should pick up the rock texture. I'm going to click the plus and again create a weight blended layer normal, and again save this rock layer info to our materials folder. There we go. So now we have rock, and I'm going to do plus create one more layer, and I'm going to call this one dirt. And again plus weight blended layer normal, materials, save the dirt layer info into the materials folder and press save. What this now allows us to do is we can, within our paint tool, we can select one of these layers, let's say rock. I can adjust my brush size and my tool strength, and I can now paint those materials onto our surface. Now, everything's looking very glossy at the moment, and that's because our material needs a bit more work first. So I'm just going to go back to my landscape material, go down to where it says roughness, and type in 1 and then hit apply. This will now make it no longer as reflective, so the light is not going to be bouncing off it, making it as shiny. And I'm going to do the same with specular, just make that 1 as well. Now, what we can also do is if we go back to our materials, so let's say our forest, our dirt layer here, you notice we also have our normal maps here, so we can also do the same process. We can go to landscape, layer blend, copy, so Control C, Control V, hook this up to our normal, move these up here just so they're out of the way a bit, and now I can drag our normal maps for each of those textures to the associated texture name here. This will just give a bit more detail to those materials. So rock to rock, and then grass, grass to grass, then hit apply. So this will just add a bit more texture to our surfaces, make them a little bit more, look like they pop a bit more. Now, there's one more thing I'm going to want to do before I finish in this window. So I'm just going to move these out of the way again, just tidy it up a bit. So I can just drag these to move them around. Use my left mouse button. I'm going to right click here and type in landscape grass output. So what we're doing here is we've created this landscape grass output here. If I have it selected, you'll notice that under the grass types and the index, we have this option called grass type. Now we haven't created a grass type yet, so we can do that at this point here. So I'm going to go back to materials, right click, type in grass, and add a landscape grass type. I'm just going to call this grass type. And if I double click on this, this will open up a new window. It's going to again shrink this down. And this is where we can add in things like grass variety. So grass variety means if we want to have grass applied to every layer that has the grass material applied, we can have it automatically add it in without us having to randomly go in there and painting in individual blades of grass and adding in static models into our scene. So I can go to grass varieties, hit on the plus button and the drop down. I can go to my grass mesh, and if I have any grass in my scene, which I have already loaded into the template, I could select, let's say, grass 07 and hit save. We can now add that grass type into the mesh. Let me just go back to my landscape material quickly. So with my landscape grass, I can go over to our grass type and choose our grass type here, like so. I can type in, so I'm going to, on my landscape grass, click the grass button, place a new node before it by dragging it, and type in landscape and landscape layer sample. And I'm going to call this grass. So I want to call this the same layer name as what I've chosen up here, that I want the grass materials from this grass type here to be applied to every layer that has the layer name grass applied to it. If I hit apply now and then save, this might you might notice that now my scene loads in loads and loads of grass into my level. So to control how dense this grass is, we would need to go back to our grass type option here, and then under that grass mesh we can adjust the grass density. So this will be how much grass it spawns per sort of inch or meter. If I want to add more variety in there, I can go back to grass varieties, add another element, and under this static mesh, let's type in grass again and look for a different type of grass. So let's say grass free this time. And let's again pull this down a bit just so it's not too dense. So what it's now going to do is randomize between these two varieties of grass and apply it to every layer where we have grass texture applied. If I press play, you'll notice that this grass will load in. So grass won't load in when it's far away. So you notice as we get close up, things will start popping in. This is to try and save system memory. And these don't actually have any collisions on them. But it's a very quick way to add materials to surfaces, kind of semi-procedurally / semi-randomly. If I want to not have if I don't want to have grass there, I can still go into my paint tool and just paint that area to have a different texture to it. And now you'll notice that the grass doesn't apply to the dirt layer, for example, or wherever we have the rock layer painted. It does take a moment to update. And obviously some stat messages may creep over just because of the way the meshes are set, and also the fact that we have a brush fall off. But it is a way where we can add in quite quickly static meshes across an area tagged by the same sort of naming convention. But it's not the only way. There is a way as well where if we want to add in foliage in a bit more controlled manner, we could always go up to here where it says landscape mode, and we have this option here called foliage, or shift free. This is our foliage tool. So very similar to our landscaping tool, we can adjust our brush size, our density, we can add arrays, we can fill in areas. So we could click on an area and just fill in the entire texture, or in this case, landscape. I just want to use the paint because I'm not going to be worrying about anything else. But what I can do here is if I go to foliage and I go to, let's say, foliage set, and I choose brushes and find some brushes for us. So I'm going to go with these brushes here. I can select by holding Shift and selecting multiple brushes. I can click and drag these into my foliage type here. And it'll take a moment to load them up because it's got to reload the shaders. And now it will have these 4 types of brushes loaded into my paintbrush. And if I was to click down anywhere, left mouse button anywhere, it would add in a load of those brushes into, so I need all these meshes into that area. Now at the moment that's quite dense. So to adjust that, I need to adjust the paint density. So let's pull it down a bit and click again. So now they're not quite as on top of each other. If I want to have even more control, I can go to single instance mode and I could choose all selected, where it would add in every single one of those brushes on top of each other, or cycle through selected, which is what I actually want to do. And now every time I click, it's going to add one of those bushes into our scene. We can do this as many times as we want. So let's say we want to add in different types of foliage. So these ones here, I can now keep clicking through and it'll go through every single option that we have loaded into this window here. If I do not want to use one of those foliage static meshes, I can click on it on a little tick angle here. And when it's not selected anymore, it will go darker. And now when I click, it's only going to use the static meshes that are loaded into it, which are these ones here that are a little bit more visible, not with a dot as quite as grayed out as the others. So we can use the foliage mode brush to essentially apply trees or bushes or rocks even to our scene in a bit more of a random way than if we was to, let's say, manually place them in. And it also conforms these to our terrain. So where if I was to try and drag this bush into our scene, let's say I drag this in like this, it won't actually reorientate the static mesh to that surface because that mesh is always going to be facing upright. So let's see if let's try and apply it to this mountain over here. It's a bit more steep, it'll be a bit more obvious what I mean. Kind of see that it's not snapping to our floor. So as I drag it towards the mountain, it's not aligning itself to the curvature of this space, like so. Whereas if I was to do this through the foliage tool and then click, the bush is clung to that surface. And if I go into my landscape brush and I was to go back to sculpt and sculpt my surface, so let's just reduce the size of this a bit and make some changes, my foliage will update to any sculptural changes I make to my landscape. So this is where this has an advantage. If I press play, you'll notice though that these foliage assets though do not have collision on them. If I want to remove any of my assets, I can use the erase tool. So in this case, it'll erase everything that is selected. So if I don't want to erase my green bushes, I just have the other assets selected and it won't delete them. But if I select everything, so I could go just toggle these all back on for a second, now it will delete everything that is not enabled in our scene. Sorry, it will delete everything that is enabled in our scene and not anything that's grayed out. So you can, by playing about with these tools, start to add life to your scene fairly quickly and fairly systematically without having too much performance issues. So that is the landscaping tool. We've created a custom material that we could always apply more values into. And again, the template will have more options than what we're showing you in this video. This is the foliage mode where we can paint in models into our scene. So the paintbrush, if I do that, for example, will do loads of assets. Whereas if I was to go to single instance mode, it only does one per click. But again, if you're wanting to create large landscapes really quickly, these tools are very, very efficient on the system memory for your machine. If we scroll down, let's just check. So you'll notice that when I was on about collision by default not being on, we can actually change that. So when you paint things, if you go into collision preset and add block all, And I now start adding in these models. Say down here and I press plus. These ones will have a little bit more collision on than the ones that I painted in, but they're still not quite there. You can see that, for example, this bush here has collision on, but the other ones do not. That is because it only applies it to the one I have selected. So if I want to apply collision to all of them, I'd have to have them all selected by holding Shift and clicking them all that way. Going back into my collision preset and adding block all. And now if I go back in, every asset that we've added in now will have collision. But you would not want to have collision on, for example, the grass. Otherwise our player would not be able to move through our scene. So for trees and for bushes, you can add individual collisions to them to stop people walking through them. But just think about how they're going to navigate your scene and your environment when you do so. And as you see, it retroactively applies this to everything within our scene fairly easily. And that covers our landscape and foliage tools. We will continue looking at future world building options in future videos. If you have any questions again, don't worry you can always leave them down below or email myself. And we'll see you again soon on another Unreal Masterclass video. Goodbye.